about a 3 hours training, so we're going to condense it into about 30 minutes. So if I go really quickly or scoop over some stuff, ask a question or two, and we'll fit in as much as we can. It just is going to be kind of condensed. My name is Ethan Ellisted. I know I've seen a lot of you here around before, and my background is really in urban planning and community development. And I've done a lot of research on how that sort of affects the culture of community, especially in New Orleans. And
my name is Kathleen Onifer. I'm an urban planner, urban designer, and I've actually read the entire proposed zoning ordinance. I do not remember all of it, but I waded through the whole thing.
So if everybody, before you start, I want to make sure everybody has one of these guidebooks and one of the fact sheets. So if you do not, we're going to send someone to help pass them out.
On it.
All right. So real quickly, I want to just walk through how all these different processes that you've heard about kind of interrelate to each other, starting with the New Orleans master plan. Was anyone here involved in the master planning process post-Katrina? They should be with us as well. Okay, so 1 or 2 people. So if you think of the master plan, think of the master plan as sort of the guide of the vision of how New Orleans is moving forward, right? A lot of it is, the analogy I use in my longer presentation is think of like a bowling alley, right? The lane is sort of what you want to be in, and the master plan is sort of like when kids bowl, they have bumpers that come down. The master plan is also in a way kind of like helps provide those bumpers so you can't go too far off track of what the plan for the city is going to be, right? What's really interesting about the master plan itself is the master plan doesn't say very much specifically about culture in New Orleans. The previous planning processes that happened before the master planning process, a lot of them went much more in depth of the culture community and how culture affects the city. It does not really do that in the master plan. For some reason, a lot of that was not put in the plan, which is sort of telling as to how the city deals with culture at this point. From the master plan, you also have the land use maps. Now, when you have these books, let me see if I can show you what a land use plan map actually looks like. Yeah. And usually we have a slideshow, but today we are technology free. Yeah.
All right.
So you have, right, sort of this patchwork of color, and each one of these colors represents a different type of land use. So in these books, it breaks down what each one of these is, right? So in these pages, you can go through what these are. So
there's Frenchman Street.
Right. So you can see in this book, yellow is residential. Residential is generally where people live, houses and apartments.
So we use this for our own, will you kind of orient us on the Frenchman Street map?
Yeah. And so what Ethan's really talking about is land use, and these colors can represent either existing land use, so what's there right now in terms of use, but more frequently they're used in a regulatory framework to represent future land use. So based on the plan, this is what's sort of set up for the future. Right. So what do people think green is?
Park.
Right.
Park, open space.
Open space. So this is the park right here, and our neutral grounds in New Orleans are put in as park, like green space, park space, land use, that nothing could be built on any particularly wide neutral land in the future as a different land use. So right there we've got the Elysian Fields on this green space here, right? You've got Frenchman Street coming down here with the mixed use.
And so this is the sort of Club Central on Frenchman Street right here below the park.
That is
that little big gray area
block
right there. All right.
And that is the mixed use land color. And then what do you guys think this yellow is over here? If you guessed a land use, what would that be?
Commercial.
Residential.
Residential, because it's the neighborhood around it.
So you have the basic colors. You have yellow, which is residential. You have gray, which is mixed use. And mixed use, pretty simply, is when you have two uses that kind of come up against each other. So a real simple way to think about it is think of a store in New Orleans. You might have a corner store with something on a store on the bottom and people living on top. Right, two uses in one. Also think of that instead of one store, think about that along a block. You might have a house or apartment building, a store, a bar, a club. That would be a mixed use block. So that is this area. You also have institutional uses, which are blue on the map, which are things like schools. It would be the courthouse, things like that. Hospitals.
Exactly. So at Tulane and Broad, what's that blue block?
Right.
Institutional.
Exactly. Exactly.
I'm reading mine.
Exactly. That's what we like to see.
That's right. And you have purple, which is industrial, which are like factories, right? And red, which is commercial, strict commercial use. So, you know, big stores, a Walmart generally would be in red, right? But so the important thing to notice is these are in big blocks, right? This is not one little store. This is a big piece of Frenchman Street, all with the same land use, which means that it's not specific into what can happen in each building, in each lot, in each area, right? Land use is the overarching sort of guide as to what can happen in that area. So when you look at the master plan, you see the land use maps, that's what these are. Zoning, however, is much more specific. It's specific things that can tell you what can happen in each parcel, in each building, right? So it breaks it down in a much more specific way. If you want to know what can happen in a building, you look at the zoning code. If you want to know what can happen in the area, you look at the land use map. Right? From zoning, but just because you are zoned for something, right? So say you have commercial zoning or CU1 or whatever it is, that does not mean you can automatically do whatever it says in that code, right? It will tell you there's a lot of different things you can do, right? But in order to do it, a lot of times you need the permit as well, right? So the permit is even more specific than the zoning code. So you need to go from checking the land use to the zoning and then to the permitting process. Once you get to the permitting process, then you can do something like have lobbying, right? So.
Right, and so I think, you know, that's the key point on, we're gonna unpack a couple of those, but on top of permitting, there's even one more point, right? If we're thinking of land use and the master plan that we have in the city as the force of law, that's the sort of basic ground future trajectory. Zoning is the legal tool that we use to regulate what happens in land use. And so that's why it gets really complicated, and that's why the zoning code is like 500 pages long, right? That we all know that permitting is a very sort of legal process. And then enforcement is a sort of final step on that, particularly as it relates to the sort of cultural community. And that as you sort of head towards really having an operating land use as a live music playing business, enforcement is going to be a step on that process and that regulation as well.
And so the way that I kind of think about it is kind of an upside down triangle, right? It gets more broad and gets much more specific as you go forward, with the end result and sort of the point of that triangle being what you're actually allowed to do in that space. So it sort of goes land use, then zoning, then permitting, and then enforcement at the bottom. But I think just because, like I said, there's also different types of things within each zoning process. You can have a permitted use or a conditional use, right?
Right, so I mean, so let's talk about the difference between mixed use and commercial use. Why do you guys think that Frenchman has that block of gray as mixed use there instead of a block of red for commercial land use?
People living above.
So it's because there's people living above. What are some other reasons? If it's also about the future trajectory of the street.
Right, there's little grocery stores, coffee shops, things of
Right.
that sort.
So it's a scale, right, at mixed use that's based on it sort of being a neighborhood retail, a sort of physical scale
Yeah.
that's sort of in there. So within, and this is where it sort of gets complicated because we want to draw hard lines between the land use colors. When you go to the zoning code of those land use colors, there are different things permitted under mixed use and under commercial use. The CBD, for example, an office building, the intersection of Broad and Canal. The buildings on each corner of the intersection, there's a Walgreens, right, and like some really big commercial buildings. Those blocks are red because they're allowing a much more sort of expansive definition of commercial. As you keep heading down Broad Street, it goes to mixed use because the neighborhood, as participating in part of the master plan process and as part of looking at the future trends of the area, wanted to push for a scale of commercial corridor development at that sort of mixed use scale. And so that's frequently why we're sort of, if you look at sort of the master plan itself, there's a lot of mixed use within the area. And that's not to say that any existing business needs to add another use to it in order to continue to function. It's really a tool about sort of the scale of business that operates at that level. So then when you sort of go to mixed use, again, being at Frenchman, you go and you look into the zoning code, there will be a list of what are, as of right, or permitted uses. And those are uses that if you're working at, if you want to work at that, whatever that sort of scale or use is, you can do with no other hearing. You just have to sort of have your basic, you have to go through permitting, you still have to get your certificate of occupancy and anything from health and safety boards. But you don't have to go through the city planning commission to get a use approved because it's as of right. Legally, it's cool. Then there'll be a section of permitted uses, right? Like, and that's sort of in the as of right section. The section is conditional uses. And that's where this gets the sort of to the point of all of this regulation is it's a system of sort of negotiated trade-offs, which works well when you can have a really open and vibrant negotiation and works really poorly when you're not having a negotiation that sort of recognizes the trade-offs that are made. So conditional uses, live music is almost always,
virtually in
every case, listed as a conditional use.
If it's allowed at all, it's a conditional use.
Right. But restaurants serving, almost every sort of a restaurant over a certain size or a restaurant serving alcohol are almost always a conditional use, which is not a statement that that those aren't uses that are not wanted in the area. They're conditional because they're wanted, but they're conditional because the process of approval is needed to include this sort of system of negotiation and this sort of more in-depth analysis of how is this business going to operate and how does it fit into the neighborhood around it. Then you sort of anything that's not in a conditional use or is not as of right permitted already and is not a conditional use, then would have to go through a zoning change to be. So let's say you bought a parcel that was residential, right? Let's say you bought a little corner store that had reverted to being a house, and so on our land use map, many of those have been made yellow now, but you wanted to reopen it as a business in some form. You would have to go back and get the land use and zoning changed on that parcel to be able to open it. So that is possible in a way that sort of a conditional use negotiation is already set up. It's a more intensive process requiring a lot more consultation with the surrounding neighborhood
and
a lot more time in order to get that accomplished.
And so if you go online and you can actually look at the proposed zoning ordinances. Also, if you go online, it's important to know there's the current zoning ordinance and the proposed zoning ordinance. So the current will tell you what you can do now. The proposed is what the city council is going to be coming back and having meetings about. And really, I think for MaCCNO, what's really important is to look at what's happening in this proposed zoning ordinance, because that's really a point where you can have input to say that this is not how we would like things to work, or we'd like to try this, or things like the definition of live entertainment. Those kind of things can be changed in the proposed zoning ordinance. So if you look at that, if you go online, you can actually download it, and you can see in each zoning district, and there's a lot of different types of zoning districts, they will tell you what is not allowed, what is a permitted use, and what is a conditional use. So if you look at it, if there's nothing at all in this chart, is not allowed as of now. If you look at there's a P, it's permitted, which means it's likely you can do it, and then C is the conditional, which is the negotiation. So for whatever zoning you are in, you can see exactly what's allowed now, and then look at the future to see what it will be. Which I think is important when we talk about the idea of a future land use map and grandfathering as well.
So, to add one more point to what he just said there, zoning not only regulates the use of a space, it also can regulate the physical form. For example, parking, which sometimes is a way of regulating use, right, because it can be really expensive to provide things that are in the zoning code and make it impossible to provide on an area. And so that's something to also think about as you look at a zoning code and you think about sort of what is required of a cultural business to operate, is that it's not just the use itself being approved, it's making sure that any physical requirements in terms of parking, lighting, setbacks.
Loading and unloading is a big one that they can change a lot.
Height,
right.
There may be a height maximum, and to sort of build a theater, you need it to be taller. Doors and fire sort of egress, those are unlikely to change, honestly, but it's worth you have to sort of dig down into those, because you could have your use approved but not actually have whatever sort of physical requirement of your cultural business be able to be allowed under sort of the physical requirements of the zoning code. So that's another side to pay attention to. that said, right, we all know buildings that are not in compliance with what the sort of future land use and sort of what current regulations would be in an area. We all know corner stores that are in a sea of yellow because they're grandfathered. They're existing uses. The example that I love to use, for example, is, let's guess what do you guys think the future land use is for O.C. Haley?
What?
For O.C. Haley
Wow.
in Central City. What do you guys think?
Commercial.
Do you think it's commercial, or do you think it's mixed use? Mixed use. Yeah. So it's mixed use, right? So, but let's think about. So, who knows about Brown's Dairy on O.C. Haley?
Yeah.
Right? What land use is Brown's Dairy right now?
Commercial.
Industrial.
Yeah, that's a fact.
Mhm. Now, why is its future land? So, who can explain to me how grandfathering works? That they get to continue to operate
Because they've been there for.
because they've been there forever, and the neighborhood is not having any. They're not in violation of any safety and permits. There's no enforcement that's trying to get them to close, so they get to continue to operate.
They just bought an extra block so that they could close off one street.
Right. Well, and so but that process, right? That part will go through City Planning Commission because that part isn't grandfathered. It's not grandfathered for them to close a street. So that they have to go through the public process on.
Is grandfathered a New Orleans thing?
No, grandfathered is a national
It's a
thing.
planning.
National thing. What is the limit of what is the limit as long as I've been there? How many years do I have to have been there before I'm considered grandfathered?
You don't have to have been there for any period of time. Now, permits are not permits. Those are put in by a local. So all of zoning, right, is imposed by a local. This is going to sound super legalese, but jurisdiction, right? So whatever city, it could be a county if you're in a small town. Whatever the legal entity is that's governing that area. Permits, right? And this is frequently where cultural businesses run into issues with alcohol permits or live music permits. Do not have the same grandfathering protection because they're not recognized under sort of our federal system as property in the same way that sort of it would be a taking for me to be like, nah, we're making this area a mall and you can't have you need to change your house to a commercial use.
And so the idea about grandfathering really is, because this is a future land use map, right? This is not how it looks right now on French Street. This is the idea of how it should look moving forward. If you have, say, this is just a completely made up example, but say you have a commercial building right here in the middle of this residential. Because this changes doesn't mean your commercial building has to go away, just like if they change it to commercial on O.C. Haley doesn't mean your house, you have to move. It just means if you move or if this commercial place closes going forward, then the next person there has to abide by what this looks like.
But, well, they have to, it doesn't mean they couldn't reopen another commercial use,
Right.
but they have to go through the full
process.
public process to have the approval.
Right.
So it's a system that's supposed to allow sort of existing businesses to continue to exist, but anything new to have another opportunity for sort of public comment
Well, I
and
think that
participation.
one of the grandfathers that the law has changed, and it's not that you don't have a due process, you have not to have a taking of the value of your property. So if you were lawful and then the law changed, you're protected. It's not a time question, number of years or something, where you're there when the law changed.
Right.
And if you're
Right,
there when
right.
the law changed, you can keep what you had, assuming it was legal.
Right,
You
right,
can keep what you had, you're grandfathered in.
right, to the old law.
Yeah.
Because you can't change the law on someone after that point.
But if you sell your business, you go, and most of them you lose it, and then maybe you're gonna explain non-conforming
Yeah.
uses next.
Mhm.
Because if you,
Yeah, and so, what she's explaining is a non-conforming use is just an existing use that doesn't match what the future use is gonna be.
Mhm.
And again,
and you can lose that, and a lot of our music clubs and stuff were grandfathered in. That's how Snug Harbor and
Mhm.
Cafe Brazil and different places were able to be on Frenchman Street and have the music clubs because they were grandfathered in when the laws began to change. But if you stop doing that for 6 months, you can lose the right to have that non-conforming use. So continuity
right.
is very important to maintain a non-conforming use. So when these
Because
laws,
it's when you sell or when it shuts down, that goes back into being part of
whatever
the current legal
Right.
framework, not grandfathered of the old.
And that 6 months window is the catch that, like you said, has caught a
That's
lot
how they
of.
got rid of
That's
Donna's.
what happened.
That's how they got rid of Donna's.
You had a question.
That
What's your
was-
name,
that
by the
was-
way?
I'm Rosalind.
Hi,
That
Rosalind.
was my question because
Okay.
the Funky Butt and Donna's on Rampart Street. And as badly as we need more clubs for the musicians in this town.
Yeah.
What can we do to help ease the restrictions on music?
So that's a very broad question.
Right. I think.
But I am going to try to give you some answers, and one of them is to explain what an overlay district is while explaining how that's an opportunity for you to support more music venues. Okay, so an overlay is this is one of those legalese terms that actually makes physical sense. It's just on top, like overlaid on top of whatever the existing maps are. Right? And they can provide special sort of rules in addition to what's on the map, or sometimes exceptions to rules of what's on the map. So they can be more permissive in an overlay area than it is outside, or it can be stricter in an overlay area that's outside. For an example, like of a sort of a non-deleterious overlay would be like, the central business district will have an overlay that allows for any given business to have to build less parking because it's in this sort of immediate area. So they're provide either extra rules, both in terms of being school marmish, or less rules in terms of reflecting what's different about a defined geographic area. And that's the important thing about an overlay, right? Is it's a defined geographic area. It doesn't go over the whole city. It frequently doesn't go over a whole neighborhood. The French Quarter is sort of the one exception to that, but that's a real defined area. And so, when we're looking at a St. Claude overlay, that's probably going to go on the first block on St. Claude, and may only extend actually the first half block on just the sort of the commercial part of the strip. What the overlay can do is change any of the elements of the zoning code that we've talked about. It could be about parking, it could be about building height, it can be frequently about the uses that are allowed in an area. So an overlay that allows more conditional uses for live music or alcohol permits, or an overlay that even goes to allowing them to be permitted and as of right within that sort of that defined area.
And so, like, if you look at the overlay, the arts and culture overlay on Frenchman, it's got specific rules for that area. So, for instance, you can have bars, but you can only have two bars per block face, right? Per block, you can have 2 bars only, right? Or you can have more conditional permits for live entertainment, but you can't have karaoke, right? So there's these conditions that go with that arts. So it's sort of an extra layer on top of the zoning that sort of trumps to some degree what had been there before. So it will give you an extra degree of permissibility on French Street to have this entertainment, but it doesn't mean you can do anything. It just means you've got to look at these new regulations.
Well, and the goal of the zoning ordinance, right, is to provide guidelines across the city. And what overlays allow us to do is to look at what's really happening in a specific area.
Right.
So I think, to sort of the point we were raising before, right, is that whether it is in Jimmy's situation, where that was a moratorium that was brought on by neighborhood associations in the area, or in the St. Claude issue, that anything that's happening in an overlay is absolutely going to involve neighborhood associations and community residents, and negotiations about what happens in that overlay and what that means for businesses and live music are really going to have to take place with the residents that are going to be in that room, because no overlay is going to pass without community support there.
Right. And I think also, to Rosalind's question, in terms of how you can make things more permissible, I think, as I said earlier, the new zoning ordinance being proposed is an excellent point to start making sure their voice is heard in that, to make sure that it reflects the interest of the cultural music community of New Orleans. Because a lot of it, as we talk about a lot, the neighborhood groups are organized, they've been doing it so they're able to get in that process quickly and have their voice heard in a way without any sort of counter argument, right? And it needs to be, both sides need to be in it, right? It can't be one pushing the other pushing one. So I think that's one point. Also, I think, just real quickly, the point about non-conforming use and the 6-month window is also an excellent thing that people can start talking about as well, because it's a point where sometimes it's just not possible to get something open again in 6 months. It's just not feasible, and if you lose that, then you put yourself in sort of this position where you've lost this non-conforming use. You have to start the process all the way over again to get back to what it once was. So that's why you see so many historic clubs that just aren't able to reopen again, because they've long ago lost that.
Even with community support, right? It's like, because all of these are legal processes of permitting, they take time and are expensive to move forward. So it's not even you have communities that are supporting a business that sort of loses a license and want it to come back. And the reality is currently right now that it's still the same process to go through. And that's because all of these are legal tools and so they have to be broadly universal. But that is, I think, would be a great policy point for this group to start looking at, is how are ways to like work with neighborhood associations to really streamline the sort of non-conforming use and grandfathering discussion.
Can you talk about live entertainment and where it fits in the New Orleans land use zoning world? As far as a stance?
I mean, it's almost always conditional, right? It's
prohibited except for permitted.
Exactly. And even where permitted, it has to be negotiated. It's almost, unless you're in an overlay district, where, and then even then there's normally then conditions attached to it being as of right, like including operating hours, decibel, like noise ordinances. And so there's very little, like there's no as of right category in the way that there are as of right categories if I want to open a sandwich shop that serves no alcohol, right? Like I can go find a commercial property sort of area and I can open a sandwich shop as long as I'm not serving any alcohol and
You got your restaurant.
yeah, and I can go through the normal zoning process.
Can it have live music?
No. That's what I'm saying.
Because
But that's the thing.
that's
Like this,
right.
alcohol and live music are these two things that are always part of a negotiated sort of conditional process
Right.
within the zoning code.
And in
itself.
New Orleans, you see the live entertainment generally in sort of commercial districts, mixed districts, clearly never in a residential district. So it's even the districts that is a conditional use. And I see some.
But I mean, to
I was
be
only gonna ask, can
Yeah.
you just give an overview of what live entertainment includes?
I'm gonna.
We have the most amazing definition. I wish I had brought it here today. It includes everything. It covers private homes. It's not, if you go online and look, go to the CZO, this is the Comprehensive Zoning Ordinance, look under definitions. And the section there on definitions defines live entertainment, and there's a separate definition of live adult entertainment, which is basically like strip clubs and stuff. But live entertainment includes anything that you do that involves any kind of musical performance or literary readings or any kind of performance, mimes. Covers mimes.
and so zoning ordinances, because they're a legal tool.
A clown for a kid's birthday party in your
Right.
backyard. Anything that is where you invite people to come. It doesn't have to be, no money has to take, it doesn't have to be involved.
Can be a
It can
jukebox.
be commercial or non-commercial. It can be a DJ operating music. It wouldn't be like a jukebox per se, because that's not live unless someone is operating it.
But amplified, there's a whole thing on amplified and unamplified, which is just that this is a point on.
But that's not in the live entertainment.
Right, but that's also, I mean, a music issue, right? The more general point on this is that the zoning ordinance is really detailed because it's a legal tool. Sometimes, honestly, too, it takes almost always the strategy of listing everything and making it conditional because they're afraid if it's not in the zoning ordinance, then that will, like, no one will go through that process, like, clearly. Right.
Free play.
Yeah, like we're good, right? And so like my example on that is that there is a bit in the zoning ordinance about when you could have dynamite blasting in the city. And you are not allowed to have it on Christmas Day, Mardi Gras Day, or Thanksgiving, and only between the hours of 9 and 5 p.m., and there has to be a 1-hour break for lunch. That is the one part of the zoning ordinance I have memorized. But it was because it was so absurd to me that this was something that was written into the zoning ordinance, right? Like, but it reflects the mentality of it, which was just list everything down. One other point, and I spent some time really trying to collapse some of the parking recommendations for another organization in the zoning ordinance. You had to have at least 2 parking spots per every bowling alley for every lane of bowling you would have in the city. And I was like, no one's allowed to bowl alone in all of New Orleans or carpool to the bowling alley. But you know, that's the level of detail the zoning ordinance gets into. And that's what business owners confront when they go through a permitting process. But it's also a level of detail that you can participate in collapsing some of those categories if necessary.
But the
or
difference with
excluding.
entertainment is compared to parking or these other things is entertainment is protected by the First Amendment. It's speech and expression. So this isn't about selling like some sort of artifact or something that's like, or like an alcohol or things like that that are don't have that. This is expression, and that's a very different thing. And when you're having laws that intrude into or regulate expression to this extent, that's why when we talk about that we have all these unconstitutional laws on the books, this is because these are laws that are intruding on expression. There's a lot of other things you can regulate. Noise, parking, litter.
Right, right.
You know, there's not a constitutional right, you
Right.
know, of parking or littering or things like that. I mean,